Anyway, that was my final comment on this space. I'm going to jump around the questions, Professor Wielenberg, just to give you a heads up. We're going to dive
Hmm.
into joy now, actually, and take a bit of a sidestep. Um, so you've kind of mentioned kind of three books that Lewis wrote that his kind of main apologetics work. You also mentioned A Grief Observed, which he wrote shortly after he lost his wife, who died very shortly after they were married from cancer. Joy is the book that Lewis kind of describes as his autobiography, where he talks about his life. And in Joy, he talks about this sort of kind of innate desire that he has within him and that we have within us, that he believes kind of points to something that's beyond this natural world. So it kind of also feeds into this idea of pain pushing us towards something beyond the natural world. He believes that joy, this desire we have, does a very similar job. Once again, I'm going to share my screen because you do a fantastic job of pulling together a syllogistic form of Lewis's argument from desire. So again, I'm going to read that out for those who are listening. So Lewis's argument from desire, premise one: all normal human beings have an innate natural desire, joy. That is for something X, where X lies beyond the natural world. Number two, every desire that is innate and natural to all normal human beings can be satisfied. Number three, so joy can be satisfied from one and two. Four, if joy can be satisfied, then there is something that lies beyond the natural world. Five, therefore there is something that lies beyond the natural world from three and four. So I think it'd be really interesting now to dive into Lewis's argument from desire, and also the reality that God isn't the only source of human desire and joy that might very well have been kind of selected for from evolution. We obviously have a lot of kind of evolutionary psychology that we have today in the 21st century, which was in its infancy in Lewis's time, that we can kind of pull into this conversation now and begin to add some interesting components and diameters to this. So back to you, Professor Wielenberg.
Yeah, and just a brief comment on Lewis's overall strategy for giving arguments for the existence of God. As I see it, he has three main ones. This argument from desire or joy is one of them, and one thing they all have in common is they all start with human nature, which I think is pretty striking. His whole thing is like sort of look within yourself, understand what kind of thing you are, and that's a starting point that he thinks will lead us um, to see that there must be this a god or higher power is a phrase he sometimes uses. Yeah. So as you said, this one it there is this, I think, empirical claim that it's part of human nature to have this particular type of desire. And Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, talks a lot about what this desire is like. One interesting thing he says is that it's a desire that is itself pleasurable to have, which is kind of interesting. I think a lot of when we think of desires, a lot of times having the desire is unpleasant. Like if you're thirsty, that's not fun. You just want to get something to drink. But so he sees this joy is the name he uses for this desire is kind of distinctive. One way it's distinctive is it like feels good to have this desire, but the way it's distinctive that is important here is, as you explained, he thinks that it is a desire for something beyond this world. So one thing that's very important about this desire is it cannot be satisfied in this life. You want something, you can't get it in this world. And he also says that we are not always sure what it is that we want, um, which is another area where I think he anticipates, psychology. We can have desires without realizing exactly what they're a desire for. um, there's this famous line from St. Augustine. He says something like, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord." And I think that kind of captures Lewis's thinking here. So he's looking at human beings and he's like, they're chronically dissatisfied, no matter what they get in this life, wealth, family, power, anything you can think of. It just never seems to be quite enough. And so it must be that we want something that we just cannot be had in this world. And the other premise, which is the quite controversial one, is like, look, if whenever we have a desire of this type, it's part of our nature to have it, and so on. there must be something somewhere that can satisfy it. And therefore, there must be something beyond this world that can satisfy this desire. So you can see he starts with human nature, and he thinks there's reasoning that pushes us to conclude that there's more than just this life. Now, the way I see evolutionary psychology coming in here, I mean, I guess there are two things. One is it's an interesting question. Is Lewis correct that this desire is a universal part of human nature? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I mean, it could be that, I guess, put it this way, to what extent is this an artifact of being brought up in a sort of theistic or Christian environment, right? It would be interesting to look at just people who are, raised in a completely secular. Do children in Sweden grow up with this desire? But what's more plausible is this sort of, humans do seem to be sort of chronically unsatisfied, at least in the long term. We're content for a bit, but then we get antsy or whatever. And so I think that, makes sense. So the thought I had was simply, evolutionary psychology is this approach to psychology that basically the basic idea is that if there are innate features of human psychology that seem to have some kind of genetic basis, can they be understood in evolutionary terms? And what that typically means is there some evolutionary advantage that this psychological trait could provide? So let me give a very, I think, simple, sort of intuitive example. I mean, fear of the dark seems to be a pretty widespread feature of human psychology, at least when we're young. Some of us outgrow it, not all of us, but most children are afraid of the dark. That one's interesting because a lot of times it doesn't really sort of make sense. Like being in the dark in a crib in a suburban house is actually quite safe. But if you think back to the type of environment that most human beings existed in throughout human history, fear of the dark would lead you to not go walking around in the dark at night, to stick close to the fire. And this would be very advantageous in terms of getting you to survive and reproduce. So the simplest way of putting it is maybe there were ancient humans that didn't mind darkness. And so they went wandering around in the dark, and we have terrible night vision, and so they didn't have any kids. We are all descendants of the cowards who stuck close to the fire, and so that's why we have this cowardly fear of darkness, right? It served our ancestors well, and so it lingers on. Okay, so now we think of this chronic dissatisfaction that human beings have. Well, that can be it's not fun, it's kind of annoying, but it can be very advantageous from an evolutionary perspective. You keep striving, you're trying to fill that hole inside yourself. That can lead you to try to attain status, to reproduce, do all sorts of behaviors that get your genes into the next generation. So suppose for the sake of argument, we have this desire for something beyond this world, which just makes us super chronically unsatisfied. Just like the fear of the darkness, perhaps there's a story that can be told as to why having such a desire would be evolutionarily advantageous. Keeps us moving. Just being easily contented and satisfied might be pleasant, but it's not great in the competition to get your genes into the next generation. And so just as we are all descendants of the cowards who stuck close to the fire, we're all descendants of humans that crave something more and are never satisfied, because that too is an advantageous trait. So the thought there is there could be an explanation for this alleged aspect of human nature that doesn't require there actually being something out there that can satisfy this desire.
I really like that. I think it adds a nice element of reality. I'm not saying that Lewis isn't trying to touch reality in what he's doing. I think he firmly believes that he is engaging with and touching reality, and that reality is kind of substantiated within God. But it's just interesting kind of, I guess, bringing in the other tools that we have available to us in a little bit more of a powerful way today, to begin to kind of explore why we might have these desires and why there is in reality actually nothing that will satisfy and complete them, because there's always more that needs to happen. I mean, I'm a very, very driven person. I'm very routine structured because I want to make the most of my time. I have a phrase which is basically no dead time. Like if I'm going for a walk as a podcast on, or I'm doing something, I'm always kind of trying to optimize things and make myself as efficient as possible. And that just comes out of me naturally. Now, I think that is, again, an evolutionary hardwired thing that's within me, that's come from those who were also like that, because they managed to get more and more accomplished and done. And you can probably just keep following that back for a very, very long time. That makes complete sense to me, more than kind of suggesting that there's something other out there that's kind of driving me to complete my to-do list. I don't think there is this divinity or this instantiated being that is God that is trying to pull that in. Anyway, I just think it's a really interesting component. If you enjoyed this clip, head on over to Locals to watch the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can freely listen to the audio-only version of the conversation. If you're on YouTube or Rumble, please like, subscribe, and then hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a new episode. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.